Hi everyone, my name is Chris Engelbrett. This is a presentation that fulfills your requirement for the state of Minnesota re-licensure in the area of best practices for teaching English learners or English language learners. This is a recorded video, but I hope to make elements of it interactive. My talking probably won't take the full hour, but there will be parts of the presentation where I ask you to pause or reflect. I will also leave some of the links or resources in the YouTube comment section or in the description below the YouTube link. So to start out, this is a picture. What you're seeing is a picture of my classroom. And each of the strings of yarn is a pin where the students' families are coming from and then linking that to our school in Wayzata, Minnesota. I think this is a cool visual. It connects our students. It connects them to my classroom. And I guess that's the first thing I just want to say is that these students have enriched my life. They make my classroom an interesting and meaningful place. So they enrich our classroom, they enrich our school and our community in general. So that's just kind of the starting off point. Today, our learning targets are that we can empathize with a language learner. The second is that we can describe methods that benefit language learners in our classroom. And the third is that we can write language objectives for a content standard. I realize that people listening to this presentation might teach kindergarten, you might teach 6th grade math, you might teach 11th grade chemistry. The goal is to give you some methods and the ability to write some language objectives for your various content areas. The first thing I'd like to start out with is actually a video. This is a newcomer student who might be in middle school, and this is a math class. And I just want you to watch it and think about how this student feels, what you learn about the student, and kind of just reflect on the classroom experience of this student.
The tests are going to be hard, but that's all right because we're going to try really hard. Isn't that right, Cameron? Yes, Ms. Keith. Okay, great. Everyone listen up. So we're going to want to work all we get from the answer and the information in the story, okay? We're going to go ahead and test, factual test, and try this actus test. Oh, test your test. We're going to read. You go to read. First on page 3.
¿Qué dijo? ¿A poco va a empezar el examen?
No, es una práctica.
We're going to take notes from the story and we're going to turn it into a math problem and we're going to walk through it together, okay? So the boy ran 3 blocks. So everyone write 3 blocks. How long did it take him to run 3 blocks? Michelle?
6 minutes.
Very good, 6 minutes. All right, so then we're going to take 3 blocks and 6 minutes,
¿Por qué
right?
el niño corre con los bloques?
¿Qué?
Sí, ¿por qué el niño corre con los bloques?
No,
Okay, so
corre
the
3
question I'm going
calles.
to go on to ask us, how long will it take him to run 20 blocks? What do we do? How many minutes is that per block?
8 minutes.
Try and remember to raise your hand if you want to answer, okay? No, it's not 8 minutes. Michelle?
18 minutes?
Nope, not 18 minutes. Yes, Enrique?
40?
40, yeah, very good. How'd you get 40?
I don't know.
You don't know? Well, 40 is the right answer. How did you get it?
I forgot.
You forgot. Okay. Does anyone know how we get 40? Yes, Moises.
40.
Yep, that's right. Very good. Great. Can you tell us how you got that?
40.
Yep, very good. But can you explain to the class what you did here, how you got that?
40.
All right, you guys, settle down.
That was so dumb.
Joe, do you want to lose your recess?
No.
Okay, then.
So I found that video pretty powerful. One thing I might do in a classroom right now after showing a video is I actually have a printout of a campfire. And then I would have students, partner students, maybe in groups of 3 or 4. And then I put a fire in the middle of the students. And then we pretend like we're warming our hands or our feet or roasting marshmallows. But the students are all then in a circle, kind of equidistant from each other, and they're in the perfect environment to have a discussion about what they just watched or read. Obviously, we're doing this virtually, so this isn't going to work. But right now, if you are around someone you can talk to, or if you just want to pause the video and kind of reflect on that student's experience, you can do that now. Another thing that we can do, I'm actually doing this presentation on a program or an app called Nearpod, which allows you to do Google Slides but have interactive elements the students can use when you're doing Zooms or presentations. So I know that you're not able to do the Post-its with me right now, but I just wanted to show you this because I think it's a cool tool. So when reflecting on the video, some of the things that I noticed were originally the student had confusion over the instructions. It was difficult for him because I don't know that there were a lot of visuals for what was happening or with the assignment they needed to do. He heard the word, I think it was a examen or a pre-test, and so that was confusing for him. Another thing that I noticed is that he was very capable of doing the work. But he couldn't communicate his thinking. He wanted to participate. So he had his hand raised, which is amazing. But I think one of the things when I was thinking about the teacher is she didn't really provide like a structure that was comfortable or made him feel successful when he was trying to communicate his thinking. I put, let's see, teacher puts student on the spot. So we're going to switch gears for a little bit and transition into who are English learners and how are they identified for our program. When families come to register students, one of the forms that they fill out is called the Home Language Questionnaire. In the Home Language Questionnaire, the basic questions are: what languages did the child learn first? What languages are spoken at home? If any of the answers to those questions is yes, then the English learner teacher at your school will give a screener, and that's going to measure the student's proficiency level in the English language. So WIDA is what you might hear English teachers use. WIDA stands for World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. It's a mouthful, so we just say WIDA. But what that means is Minnesota is a WIDA state. We've entered into a group or a consortium of other states that use these assessments and these standards and kind of a framework for learning the English language. Now, on this test, on all the WIDA tests, there's a 6-point scale. And I'm just going to go to the next slide. I think it might provide a better visual. Newcomer students who are just entering are at a level 1. So if they speak or understand virtually just very little English, they're going to be at a level 1. You can see on the left-hand side over here, 2 would be emerging, 3 developing, 4 expanding, 5 bridging, and 6 reaching. Now, having said all that, if students test above 4.5 for their overall score, and none of their areas of reading, writing, speaking, and listening are below a 3.5, or one of those, not more than one of those areas is below a 3.5, then they pass out of the English Learner Program, or they don't qualify for the English Learner Program. So 4.5 is kind of the determining factor if they get service or if they don't get service. Now, I went through that very quickly, but if you look at this graphic a little more closely, you'll see that there are 4 areas that students are measured in. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. When we talk about English, those are the 4 modalities or areas where students are going to be measured in. And when you kind of move up entering to reaching, you can see that you're going from very basic vocabulary to then words, to sentence level, to paragraphs and essays. So it's getting more complex, both with social to academic English and also the complexity of tasks that they're able to do. Couple more important visuals about WIDA and the English Learner Program. English is not just language arts. So when the students are tested on these WIDA assessments, they're tested in these 5 areas: social instructional language, the language of language arts, the language of math, the language of science, and the language of social studies. So all these various content areas have important academic vocabulary and language structures that we need to focus on and cover. One more visual to kind of like wrap your brain around this. There's receptive language, so the language that you're understanding and taking in, and that is listening and reading. And then there's expressive language, which is speaking and writing. You have oral language that is listening and speaking, and then literacy, which is reading and writing. So I like this visual because all these areas are important, but you might find that a student is really strong with their oral language, but their literacy skills are lagging. Or maybe I have a highly literate student from a country where their first language, they are very strong in reading and writing, but they have not been exposed to the oral language of English. So there are very different types of English learners, and analyzing their strengths and areas for improvement and kind of using this visual, I think is really helpful. Now, we just talked about these 4 modalities: speak, listen, read, and write. And I think most English learner teachers or ELL teachers would tell you that a great lesson incorporates all 4 of these areas. Okay, maybe not exactly 25% per, but the students have to hear English, they have to speak English, they have to read it, and they have to write it. But if you think about the way a traditional American classroom is set up, now I purposely put the font size for these 4 areas the exact same. Now on the next slide, I've resized the fonts based on what I perceive the traditional American classroom is kind of how it's set up. Does the student speak most of the time? Do they listen most of the time? Are they reading or writing? So this might be a time to pause and just think about that. What is the traditional American classroom like? And what is your classroom like if you're honest? So I found a statistic. Is it on the next page? No, it's not. Okay, I'll go back. That we focus mostly on these receptive domains. The teacher in a traditional classroom is often presenting or talking, and we're conveying information to the student that they're taking in. We also do quite a bit of asking students to read articles, to read books, you know, even our test questions, all that has to do with reading. So I feel like listening and reading are our primary modes of communication, or the modes of communication that the students have to do in our classroom. And if you think about how much they're actually talking, it's very minimal. In fact, I found a statistic that it said an English learner spends 90 seconds of any given day talking. That's kind of a wow statistic, but how can we expect these students to improve at speaking and writing if we don't create the spaces within our classroom for students to practice in an effective manner, or write with supports and structures? One way to think about restructuring our lesson design is using a method called talk, read, talk, write. Talk, read, talk, write. So in this model, you have a talk one. So you can see over here, I've broken it down a little bit. In the first talk, you're kind of building background knowledge, and you're engaging with the student and finding out what they already know, and discussing the topic for the day. I think a lot of us do that. We build background knowledge with our student, but I also think it's important that they're talking to each other and not just listening to us talk about the topic. The second part of the activity is them reading. That could be any type of academic text. And then after reading, you're going to process the text with your students, or they're going to process the text with each other. You might want to provide guiding questions, but they're going to build meaning together after reading the text. And finally, they're going to write, and they're going to communicate their content with each other, but it's going to be written down. And so again, talk, read, talk, write is something that I think about when I'm creating my lessons, just so that I'm making sure that I hit all four of those areas and providing a space for students to practice all those different elements. Okay, so a scene change, dressed in new clothes, it's a different day. Today, I'm going to do a lesson for you, and I'm going to do it in 3 different ways. So it's the same lesson, but delivered in 3 unique ways. And hopefully this will highlight things that we should be doing or should not be doing with our English learners in our classrooms. So, lesson number 1. Hoy vamos a aprender sobre las rocas que se encuentran en la tierra. Vamos a comparar las rocas por sus propiedades científicas. Por ejemplo, si son grandes o pequeñas, si son pesadas o ligeras, o si son brillantes o opacas. Lesson number 2. Hoy vamos a aprender sobre las rocas que se encuentran sobre la superficie de nuestra tierra. Vamos a comparar las rocas por sus propiedades científicas. Por ejemplo, si son grandes o pequeñas, si son pesadas o ligeras, o si son brillantes o opacas. Lesson number 3. A ver, okay. Hoy vamos a aprender sobre las rocas. Las rocas que se encuentran en la superficie de nuestra tierra. Esta es nuestra tierra. Hay rocas en todas partes de nuestra tierra. Y hoy vamos a comparar las rocas, si son grandes o pequeñas, pesadas o ligeras, brillantes o opacas. Por ejemplo, esta roca es grande, pero esta roca es pequeña. Esta roca es pesada, pero esta roca es ligera. Pesado, ligera. Y esta roca, mira, es brillante. Es brillante. Pero esta roca es opaca. So maybe my delivery was not the smoothest, but hopefully we can discuss the 3 different lessons and what went well and did not go well. This is a tool. If we were doing a live session right now, I would have students sit together in 3s in a triangle, or maybe 4s. We could do square talk, but this is called triangle talk. And the way it works is person number 1 asks a question, person number 2 answers the question, and person number 3 connects by agreeing, disagreeing, or connecting to what the second person said. And then the triangle shifts and everyone has a new role. So when I do this with students, I have an anchor chart similar to the one that you see on your screen now. And this it's a meaningful and accountable talk anchor chart. And it gives students sentence stems to discuss whatever, a video or a book that you've read or something that's happened in class. But let's talk about the lesson that I did. And full disclaimer, I speak Spanish, but I'm sure there were errors and there's accent issues, but I think you got the idea. In lesson number 1, I delivered the lesson pretty quickly. I was speaking quickly, and I didn't give you a lot of visual supports. Lesson number 2, I spoke loudly and more deliberately, slowly, but it was, even if you've taken Spanish before, maybe it was difficult to understand. And the third way, I tried to use visuals, realia. I had some visual supports on the board here with a sentence stem where you could compare the rocks. And I think, that's just demonstrating how to make meaning for our students who are English learners. So on the screen here, you see a chart that talks about comprehensible input. And this is one of the most meaningful things that I've learned in my studies of English, teaching English as a second language. Stephen Krashen is a theorist or an academic who talks about comprehensible input. And this is kind of the Vygotsky zone of proximal development. If something is too difficult, too challenging, our brains kind of just shut off. And I know that I've been in a language learning environment that was above my head, and I kind of just tuned out after the first 30 seconds. I was not engaged, and it sounded like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 that type of thing. And then if it's too easy, you're not challenging the students. So you want to get that Goldilocks just right level of language learning, but you also need the visual supports and scaffolds to make it comprehensible for our students. Here's another chart that I will include in the bottom of the YouTube link. So this shows you sensory supports. So things like real life objects or realia, manipulatives, pictures, videos, all those things will help bring the content to life and make it more accessible for our students. There's graphic support. So when we're talking like metacognition, using graphic organizers or charts or making the information visual. And then there's interactive supports where you are putting students in cooperative groupings so that they can make meaning together. Moving into a different topic, we're going to talk about language objectives. You've already seen this slide. It has the WIDA ELD standards, and this is what English learner teachers, how we break down language into the various content areas. And this is what students are tested on for the WIDA test. So there's social language, the language of language arts, the language of math, the language of science, and the language of social studies. I'm showing this slide again because regardless of what you're teaching, what grade level, you are a language teacher. So if you're working K-5, you're teaching all these content areas. If you're teaching in middle school or high school, you might be teaching one of these content areas, but there is academic language and language structures within your content area that are really important to teach and to focus on and to highlight, that will be important for our students across the disciplines, across these various content areas. On the next slide, English learner teachers often talk about bricks and mortar, or use this analogy when we're talking about language. When you think about a building and a structure, we use both these components to go together to create a building, a strong building. And I think one thing that we often focus on in our content areas is vocabulary. So we know that there's academic vocabulary, and we often teach it pretty strategically, which is important. But when we think about language, both the content area specific words, so that's the bricks on here, the vocabulary, and then the mortar words, the words that link the content words together, both of these are important to the structure of the overall sentence or of the discourse. So in this example, it says, some scientists believe that because of global warming, many glaciers in the Himalayas are melting. So if we unpack this a bit and you look at this sentence, what are the bricks in this sentence? What are the content specific words or the academic vocabulary? You could pause the video. Words like scientist, global, glaciers, all these words are content specific words. Now, mortar words in the sentence, you can see that we've italicized some. Because of is a structure in the sentence that links the words together, and it's used to justify or to explain in the sentence. And because of is a really important language structure to teach across every discipline. You're going to use because of in language arts, in science, in math, and in social studies. It shows a correlation and an explanation or a justification within the sentence. And so if we focus just on the academic vocabulary, our students won't understand this other important language structure that will help them in all the areas of their school day. So how do we write language objectives? I'm going to break it down into 3 parts. The first is the language function. And this is what the students are going to be asked to do. So an example of this would be to explain or to compare and contrast. If you look at your standards or your benchmarks of what you're teaching, the Common Core standards actually do a pretty good job of having a language function word embedded in the benchmark. So look to the benchmark, maybe highlight the word of what they're being asked to do. What skill is it that they're asked to being asked to perform? The next thing is the content vocabulary. This is what we talked about in the last slide about the bricks, the academic vocabulary. For example, if maybe I'm teaching plant life cycle, I would need to use the word seed, root, stem, stamen, pistil. And then the language structure, how the students will perform the function. This is the mortar. So the connecting words that they're going to use. So maybe you're teaching, again, life cycle or plant cycle, and then you need to teach first, next, then, finally, or however. those structure words are also really important. Here's another way to look at it. Function plus vocabulary plus the structure or stem. So here I've listed some of the function words that you might see in the benchmark, or it just might be the task that you're having the students do in your class. Are you asking them to describe, explain, compare, contrast, evaluate, identify, put things in a sequence, classify, predict, question, or match? And then the vocabulary associated with your content area. And then what is the language the ELs or ELs need in order to process or produce your function? This is where I think it's really helpful to think about what are the expected responses that I'm looking for from my students? Maybe what are they going to say or what are they going to write where I would say, wow, these students really did it well. They are really understanding what I'm teaching. So going back to the analogy, or not the analogy, the example of plant life cycle, I might look for a student to say or write something like, first, a plant begins by producing a seed. Next, it sprouts up or germinates. Then the seedling grows. It needs water, healthy soil, and sunlight in order to grow. So you get the idea, but I'm using sequencing words and that academic vocabulary together in order to produce a quality response. And after I think about what am I expecting, then I know the language structures and the vocabulary that I need to teach. So here's an example. I did my Spanish lesson for you, and I took that example and I wrote out the language objective. So I start with the content objective that students will understand that rocks have a variety of properties, including color, hardness, shape, and size. So when I take that, then I look at my language objective and what students will be able to do. Students will describe rocks by their properties using vocabulary words: dark, light, shiny, dull, round, flat, big, small, huge, tiny, soft, hard, rough, smooth, heavy, light. If you were maybe looking at fourth grade, maybe you're looking at words like metamorphic, igneous, sedimentary, but this is a first grade language objective. And then I'm thinking about the structure that students are going to use. So this rock is blank, blank, and blank. And so I might be teaching students how to use commas in a series or how to create a list of properties. Maybe also a more advanced lesson would be to identify the rock. So then I might use the language structure. This rock is blank because it has, so an example of that might be, this rock is granite because it has tiny crystals and it is gray, black, and white. All right, another example that another example would be a language objective for a sixth grade social studies class. Another example would be a language objective for a sixth grade social studies class. So here I went to the standards for social studies and took this benchmark. Students will compare and contrast the Dakota and Anishinaabe nations prior to 1800. What's nice about this is right in the benchmark, I've underlined the language function words. It's already there for me. So actually my language objective might sound pretty similar to the actual benchmark. So my language objective is students will compare and contrast the Dakota and Anishinaabe using past tense, regular, and irregular verbs. Since we're talking about the past, one thing that is super helpful for our language learners is to identify the difference between just adding an ed ending in irregular verbs where they need to memorize some of the different words that change when we put them in the past tense, but we need to explicitly teach this. So I might say, the Dakota lived in teepees constructed of buffalo hides. However, the Anishinaabe used or lived in wigwams built or constructed of birch bark. I'm using those content words, but I've also provided a language structure for the students to compare and contrast. Okay, last slide. I wanted to put some resources on this page. So if you wanted to learn more, and I hope you do, you would have access to them. I will also put links in the description of the video on YouTube here. The first one is WIDA. So WIDA, we've talked about, has standards for language learners. It's also what we use for assessments for our students. And I would highly encourage you to talk to the English learner teacher at your school and find out more about the language level of your student. Because what those teachers can share with you is the current level of the student and their ability to listen or comprehend, speak, read, and write the English language. And what you can do then is go with your teacher on the WIDA website and find the can-do descriptors. And what that does is it shows you exactly what students can do and are expected to be able to do at that language level, and how you can advance them in any particular area. So for listening and speaking, reading, and writing, how do we move them from their current level and get them to move higher and higher? WIDA also has tons of resources, articles, and information on how to work with language learners. Coloring Colorado is another great resource. It's a bilingual website and more geared towards bilingual education, but has a lot of resources and articles for parent and family outreach for how to work with language learners. So this is another great resource. And finally, I have on this right side over here, language line and talking points. And more than ever, with the pandemic happening, I've realized that we need to do outreach with our families and meaningful outreach. And the equity work that we're doing in my building is really important. And there's no one size fits all approach that's going to work for every student. And so when I think about parent-family communication, I've been guilty in the past of sending an email and expecting everyone to be able to access that information in the same way. And it's made me rethink family communication. And so being equitable means that I need to do outreach and find and connect with families in whatever way is most meaningful for them and most accessible for them. And this language line resource is wonderful because what it allows districts to do, or people to do, is to use a third-party calling line. So you need an access code, you need a subscription with this company. But what it allows you to do is to place a call in any language, and they can connect with you, and you can have a meaningful conversation with your family using whatever language they speak at home. Talking Points is also an incredible app. It allows you at no cost to communicate with your families via text, and it automatically translates into the preferred language. So you can have your entire classroom or caseload loaded in on Talking Points, draft a message, and then it remembers, or you've selected what language you want to communicate with the family in. And when you send a text blast, it automatically texts these families in their preferred language. So just some really great, useful tools for doing outreach with your English learner families. Thank you so much for listening to this rather long presentation. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you were able to pause and actually reflect on making this presentation meaningful for you in your classroom. And thank you for all the work that you do for all our students, and in particular for the time and effort and care that you spend working with our language learners. I hope you find them to be a great asset to your classroom and to our community, just like I do. Thank you.